Hello, everyone. I think participants are still trickling in, but welcome to our webinar, Interpreting Impact, during which we are taking an inside look at the new impact scoring system created by the CDC Group. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce an all-star panel, both from the CDC and amongst our expert discussants. So we're joined today by three featured speakers from CDC Group, which for those of you who may not know is the UK's development finance institution, soon to be renamed British International Investment. The CDC team includes Liz Lloyd, Chief Impact Officer, Patty Carter, Director of Development Impact Research and Policy, and Hilcha Adrians, Manager of Development Impact. As I mentioned, we're also joined by two leading experts from the impact investing field, Mike McCrellis, Executive Director of Impact Frontiers, and Kathy Clark, Faculty Director of the Center for Advanced Social Entrepreneurship at Duke University Fuqua School of Business. Before I hand it off to Liz, who is going to kickstart the discussion, I wanted to set the stage by sharing just a few remarks on the importance of impact scoring, the relevance of impact scoring, and our field's growing discipline around impact measurement and management more broadly. The impact investing field, as many of you on this call know, has evolved in leaps and bounds in recent years, thanks to the introduction of standards and frameworks for impact management and measurement, from the Impact Management Project, which Mike McCrellis has been an important part of, to the Joint Impact Indicators, to the operating principles for impact management. Investors have now increased access to guidance on best practices across the impact investment value chain. However, at the same time, one common pain point that we hear a lot about at Bluemark among asset allocators is how to go about evaluating a diverse array of investment opportunities in a way that incorporates an assessment of an investee's unique impact characteristics while also allowing for ready comparisons across a portfolio and for consistency of decision-making. CDC Group, with its long track record of investing for development impact in emerging and frontier markets and its deep bench of impact management expertise, is as well positioned as any investor I can think of to tackle this challenge. So with no further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Liz to take the baton here and introduce the CDC scoring system.
Well, thank you very much, Christina. And you introduced us very well, indeed, including the fact that our name is changing to British International Investment from the 4th of April. So I feel that we can head straight on in to setting the context and where our impact score comes into our whole impact management framework. So, as you mentioned, there are some very important frameworks out there. We are one of the founding signatories of the operating principles for impact management. And our 2020 verification showed we had built strong systems on principles 4 and 5 through our development impact dashboard and contribution assessments at the individual investment level, which are the primary decision-making tools we use at each deal level. But we still had room for improvement on principle 2, how to manage our strategic impact on a portfolio basis. And this is one of the places the score comes in. It's an evolution from our previous development impact grid that we had used before. And it does a few things. One, it's better aligned with our strategic objectives. We're entering a new 5-year 22 to 26 strategy period, which has objectives of productive, sustainable, and inclusive investments. The other evolution is it includes impact priorities such as climate and gender and diversity in every investment. And thirdly, it allows for ex-post updating. So the previous score had only allowed for an assessment before we made the every investment. So that's where the score fits into our whole impact management framework. And if I come on to some of the design features, which we discussed at some length before we sort of did the detailed work, we thought it was important to emphasize what the score does and what it does not do. It is a portfolio level tool. It complements our individual deal level impact measurement and management tools. It extracts information from our development impact theses, which are well discussed at every investment committee. It attempts to minimize subjectivity. It's here to send clear signals to change behavior and incentivize the right origination and portfolio management. And it deliberately excludes a lot of decision relevant nuance and detail. So it's a portfolio level tool. We don't have a minimum threshold for deals. It is predictable and pragmatic. It is very much linked to our investment process. It is based on information which is reasonably available. We feel it is credible and simple. It's credible, it's grounded in our impact framework, and it is grounded, as Paddy will talk about later, in development finance key rigorous principles. But it is simple, it's not the full picture. And importantly, because it is linked to remuneration, it has to be assurable. And so the design favors simplicity and objectivity to make it externally verifiable. So those are the key design features. And let me hand over to Paddy to talk a bit more about how it is grounded. Thanks, Paddy.
Thanks, Liz. Hello, everybody. I'm going to start with where our impact objectives came from and how we think about what high and low impact means, which is, after all, what we're trying to capture with this scoring system. And then I'll hand over to Hilche, who will explain how the scoring is done in practice. So as part of our developing our new 5-year strategy, we went back to first principles and we asked ourselves the 4 questions you can see on this slide. What is development? What role does private investment have to play and where is it most needed? Why is public intervention in private markets needed? And then we brought all that together to ask, therefore, where can we have the most impact? And the results of that exercise are written up in the paper that you can see on the slide, which you can download from our website. So we think 3 things need to happen to bring about development. Economies need to be capable of producing more good things per person, broadly interpreted. Those good things need to be shared across society and not just limited to a wealthy minority. And they need to be produced in an environmentally sustainable way. And that is where our 3 impact objectives of productive, sustainable, and inclusive came from. I'm going to talk about them a bit more on the next slide. We need DFIs and perhaps other types of impact-oriented investor because the social returns on investment can differ from the private financial returns. So investment motivated solely by financial returns will not get us everything that society needs. DFIs like CDC, who can tolerate more risk and lower average portfolio returns. Our shareholder wants us to exceed 2.5% gross. We can generate social returns in ways that purely commercial investors would not. An investment can generate big social returns, broadly speaking, in 2 ways. First, there are positive externalities, social value that is not reflected in a firm's revenues, such as, for example, the public good of knowledge, which can be used by others, or avoiding negative externalities like carbon emissions. And then secondly, there are distributional objectives. Societies get special benefits from businesses that help eliminate poverty, for instance, but the market doesn't reward you with extra profits for doing that. And this is where I would include investments that help the world make progress towards particular sustainable development goals, which are really just elaborations on what poverty means once you consider all its aspects. Hilche, could I go to the next slide, please? So here are those 3 impact objectives that we are trying to pin down in our impact score. So starting with productivity, so all investments raise productivity, but we're not just looking for high output to capital ratios. We want investments that are going to do the most to raise everybody's standard of living. And what a highly productive investment means to us is one that meets the most pressing development needs, which is where the SDGs come in. But we're also looking for investments that have more broad-based positive spillovers across markets and economies, ultimately helping to push up real incomes by addressing constraints on growth. And that can be through supplying tangible outputs like reliable electricity or foreign exchange earnings, which can be really transformative in an economy, or it can be through less tangible ways of affecting the behavior of many firms at a market level, perhaps by pioneering new business models, which we call catalyzing markets. Our sustainable objective is all about investments that do the most to decarbonize the economy and to help people and businesses adapt to a hotter planet. So here, high impact means the most transformational. Last but not least, productive and sustainable economies are not worth having if they only benefit a few people and leave most people living in poverty. You can look at this two ways, across and within countries, and our system incorporates both. Of course, the two overlap because when we are looking at benefits to specific groups of people within countries, they are more likely to be low income in poorer countries. We take a country view when we assess investments, when we're looking at those broad-based and indirect impacts where we cannot really pretend to say we know who is specifically going to benefit, but we use information on direct beneficiaries, workers and customers where we can obtain it. In that way, we are able to reward investments in middle-income countries that have direct impacts on lower income sections of society, for example. So before handing over to Hilche to show you how these scores are computed, I just want to say a few words about what we're trying to compute. We're not trying to measure impact in the same sense as a dollar valuation would. If you wanted to know how much impact our investments have had, then me telling you that we scored an average of 6 wouldn't really answer that question. A score is a bit more like a ranking than a measure. It helps us prioritize our investments and everything that Liz spoke about, the role of a portfolio level tool. But whilst the score is better thought of as a ranking than a measure of magnitude, it does express our view on how we will compare relative impact across the many different types of investment that we do. A score of 4 is worth twice as much as a score of 2 when we aggregate this stuff up and compute our portfolio average. And to the extent that there are trade-offs across our objectives, then this is one way of us managing them. So there really is no science behind how we arrived at these comparative judgments. We tested the system, we consulted our shareholder, and we arrived at a position where we felt that a score of 2 or 3 in one part of the system is as important to us as a score of 2 or 3 in another part of the system. We have not discovered a natural yardstick for measuring impact. Rather, these scores express our institutional view of what impact means and how it compares across different things. Okay, with that, I'm going to hand over to Hilche now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paddy. So with that background on what our objectives are and where they came from, I'll now take you through how the system works. In the next slide, if it allows me to go to the next slide, there it is. So basically, every investment that we make from 2022 onwards will have an impact score attached to it. And every score will be composed of 3 subscores. So a productive score, which ranges from 0 to 4, where a 4 signals very strong alignment with that objective and a 0 signals weak alignment. Then we have the sustainable score, which ranges from -1 to 4, and we have the inclusive score, which ranges from 0 to 4. And those summed up together make up an investment's total impact score, which is deliberately kept at 10, because when we tested the system on over 400 transactions last year, we actually found that there were very few opportunities for investments to score above 10. So we decided to simplify and kept the score at 10. So when we then dive one level deeper and consider how each of those 3 scores is calculated. So starting with the productive score. So we start with the degree of need. So the degree of need is linked to the primary development outcome or need that the investment is addressing, which is linked to the SDGs. So it could be access to power or access to finance, access to jobs or water, for instance, where we've used publicly available data to segment countries into 4 buckets of low need, medium need, high need, and very high need. And then we look at intensity, the second part, which is another way of saying how much impact are we achieving for every dollar that we invest. So for instance, in the context of power, we would, for instance, look at the megawatt hours produced for every $1 million of investment that goes in. So taking 1 and 2 together, so they go in a matrix, which we can share a publication we recently put out with you afterwards, so you see how that works. So that gives you a base score. And then on top of that, we award points for economic enablers. So economic enablers are investments that have large spillover effects on other firms in the economy. So really help to make other firms more productive through lowering prices of intermediate goods, for instance, or really improving the availability of those goods and services to help other firms to grow. And that's based on an approved list that we have developed. And then finally, we award points at 1 or 2 for catalyzing markets, which is what Paddy just discussed, which is also helping other firms or helping to improve market structure, for instance, through pioneering new business models, or for instance, developing the first PPP in a country or testing it out and paving the way for other investors to invest in such structures as well. So that's the productive score. Going to the sustainable score, which there's a lot of detail on the slide, but basically what you need to know is that if an investment qualifies for climate finance, for which we use the joint NDB methodology, it will automatically score a 3, and in some instances even a 4, depending on the amount of emissions avoided, in the case of renewable energy, for instance, or in the case of forestry, we look at the amount of carbon sequestered. If an investment doesn't qualify for climate finance, it will score, if it's fossil fuels, which we can only do in exceptional circumstances when it's Paris aligned, but even those investments would receive a score of -1. And otherwise we look, is it in high emissive sector? So for instance, in the case of more heavy manufacturing or food and agriculture, would score a 0, and low emissive sectors such as IT or financial services, for instance, would score a 1. In the case of adaptation and resilience investments, we actually look at the use of proceeds. So if it is over 30% of the proceeds go towards adaptation and resilience finance, it scores a 3. And if it's over 50%, it will score a 4. So that's the sustainable score. And that takes me to the last score, which is the inclusive score, where the first question we ask is if we know the poverty profile of the key stakeholders that we're reaching through the investment, where we use the poverty line of $5.50 per day. If we know, or we can estimate it during proxies, or we can run a survey to find out like who like the people we're reaching, we use that to estimate or to calculate the inclusive base score. So for instance, if 30 to 50% of the people being reached through the investment lives on the $5.50 per person per day, the investment will have a base score, inclusive score of 3. But then there are some investments where we simply don't know. So imagine we invest in a power plant, the power is being sold to the grid, and we don't know who ultimately will be using that power. In those cases, we will use a default country score instead. So again, a bit similar to the degree of need. In productive, we have segmented countries into alpha, beta, gamma, and delta countries, where delta are the most developed countries, least fragile, such as Morocco in our geographic remit, and the alpha countries are the least developed countries or most fragile, including, for instance, the DRC or Sierra Leone. So that will give you the inclusive base score, and then on top of that, we look at gender and diversity investments. So For gender, we use the 2x framework, which some of you on the call might be familiar with. So if the investment qualifies for 2x, we award 1 additional point. And for diversity finance, specifically for our Africa portfolio, we all have developed a similar framework that's specifically targeting Black African ownership and leadership, and those investments will achieve or be rewarded with 1 additional point as well. So that's the score. Feels like a bit of a crash course, probably, but if you want to find out more, we'll share the link to a recent publication where you can find out a bit more detail of how each of the 3 dimensions work. But I did want to take you through an example now, so you can see how the score actually works in practice and how it is applied to an actual investment. So imagine we would be looking at investing in a solar farm in Ghana. So a utility scale power. So looking at the productive score first, so the primary need or development need we are addressing is access to power, which in Ghana compared to other countries that are eligible for official development assistance would come out as medium need. Assuming that the intensity in terms of the megawatt hours produced for every $1 million of investment comes out as in line with our benchmarks. So taking 1 and 2 together, that gives us a base score of 1 when you use the matrix. And then on top of that, this investment would qualify as an economic enabler, given it provides or improves access to power for many businesses and the wider economy. So we award the investment with 1 additional point there. It doesn't qualify for catalyzing markets. It's a relatively well-tested technology and business model, so no additional points there. So that would take the total productive score to a 2, which kind of signals that this is an investment that moderately aligns with our productive objective. Then we look at the sustainable score. So as you imagine, renewable power would qualify for climate finance, so automatically receives a score of 3. In some instances, this type of investment could have received a score of 4, depending on the amount of emissions avoided for every $1 of investment, which in this case is not taking us over the threshold that we've set. So the score remains at 3, which is a good score and a strong alignment with our sustainable objective. And then finally, we look at inclusive. So as you can imagine, a utility scale power of solar farm, we won't be able to know who will be using that power. So rather than using the reach to low income of people under $5.50, we use the default country score for Ghana instead. So Ghana is a Gamma country, and so the score comes out as a 1. And then we look at gender and diversity. So in this case, the investment doesn't qualify for 2x, but it does qualify for Black African ownership and leadership, given high levels of representation at the ownership level or at the leadership, management or board level. So we assign 1 additional point there. So that takes our total inclusive score to a 2. So adding those up, you would get a total score of 7, which is a good score, which signals that this investment is aligning well with our 3 impact objectives. And that would be the type of information we include in the investment papers alongside the impact dashboard and the contribution assessment to take into account in the overall decision-making of the investment. So that was the end. I hope that gave you a bit of an idea of how the scoring system works in practice. So I'll stop sharing now and hand over to Christina to take us to the panel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Liz, Patty, and Hilche. That was a fantastic overview of your new scoring system. We have nearly 200 participants on this call and a very active chat and Q&A now with lots of questions rolling in. So I'm actually going to abstain from asking my own questions and start by handing it over to our expert discussants, Mike McCrellis and Kathy Clark, to allow them to comment and ask a few pointed questions to get the things going here. But I will take the baton back at some point to make sure we cover at least a good share of the questions that are rolling in on the chat and the Q&A. I also want to thank Kathy for posting the link to CDC's recently published paper that describes the system in some detail. A number of participants are asking for copies of the slides so they can review them. So I'll leave that to CDC to decide whether or not they're going to be circulating those after. But over to, I think, Mike, you're going to kick it off here.
Great. Thank you so much, Christina, and thank you, everybody. And I want to especially congratulate CDC, soon to be BII, for this great piece of work. And thank you for being willing to share it with the sector, because I know that so many investors are struggling with the same things, and it really helps them to see what leaders in the field have done. I was really interested in learning more about how this impact score informs decision-making, and how, in particular, if this is used at the portfolio level, for the most part, if I understand it correctly, and then there's a separate dashboard at the investment level, how are each of these tools used to support different decisions, and by whom, and how do the tools support those decisions?
Yeah, let me take this one. So for all transactions, our impact analysis consists of 3 elements which we use together. So first, what we call the impact dashboard. So that's the impact thesis and what impact the investment is going to have. Second is a contribution assessment. So what difference are we making? Financial contribution, value add contribution. And thirdly, the impact score. How aligned is the investment to our impact objectives? For example, if an investment had a very high score, but 0 contribution, it's not delivering impact. And in fact, as a DFI, we will be extremely unlikely to go ahead with that. So the impact score is a powerful tool to manage our strategic impact. But we do admit it's a simplistic tool. There are some questions coming in the chat, well, or simple perhaps rather than simplistic, but about transition risk. We have a ESG team that looks at the physical risks of transactions where there's high risk. So it's one part of our decision making, and very much aligned to our strategic objectives.
Great. Maybe I can step in with another question. Thanks to the team. This is so clear and so helpful as an example of impact scoring, which a lot of funds are starting to do now as a decision-making tool. I had a question, but I'm going to try to wrap it with 2 other questions that I saw in the chat because I think they're relevant, which is, my question was about, you mentioned that this is actually tied to remuneration within your team, but I wanted to ask like the 2 other questions, which is kind of, are you rating current impact or expected impact? And how does that relate to remuneration? At what points in the cycle are you making this assessment, and when does it actually relate to the contribution of your team? And the other one is there any threshold for what is good enough for you to invest or not?
Okay, let me take the parts around remuneration and well, I'll try and go on expected impact, and if Hiltra wants to come in, she will. So first of all, in terms of a mission-driven impact investor, we are incentivized on both sides of our mission, as it were. So financial returns and development impact, and kind of some corporate elements. And so the impact score is part of our performance framework. It's all publicly available documents. And for all staff, of certain categories of all staff, that we have a long-term investment program, and the development impact side counts for 40%, and that is equivalent exactly to the financial returns component, and that is measured by what is called the aggregate impact score, so essentially a portfolio score, which is the impact score of individual investments. And this is a new framework, so it's come in for the 22 to 26 strategy period, and the score is taking into account the impact of the investment, so not the company as it is today, but what our expected investment will deliver. So in the power example we gave, obviously today there is no power on that field, there will be power, and the ex post scoring allows us to see if we've delivered that. So it is possible, not for power perhaps, but for a financial institution, that the financial institution will deliver very good returns. But if our impact thesis was that it was going to be a MFI and reach low income women, and for some reason it pivots during the course of its business and does something completely different, we would ex post score a very low score for impact and potentially a high score for financial returns. Equally, it can be the other way around. So let me pass over to Hilche to answer about what is good enough.
Sorry, could you repeat that part of the question?
Sure. There was a question in the chat basically saying you have this 10-point score system. Is there a threshold under which you would definitely not invest if it's scored lower than 2 or 3 or whatever it is?
So no, there isn't. So we deliberately haven't set a hurdle because we do see it as a portfolio. We have a portfolio target and not a targeted deal level. And even if there are deals that may be scoring lower, but because of other reasons being this contribution, we feel it's very much worth pursuing. So we deliberately didn't want to set a minimum hurdle. But obviously lower, if there's a lower scoring deal, then we have to have that discussion why we are pursuing the deal. No, there is, short answer, there isn't a minimum hurdle.
Thanks. Mike, you want to?
Mike, do you want to take
Yeah. I was actually reflecting on some of the questions coming through the chat, which reflect also my own, about something we haven't talked about as much, which is the process of managing organizational change and building buy-in and increasing the degree of alignment of different people in the organization around what does impact mean for us. And I was just wondering if the team could share any reflections from your experience on, were there some areas where you really had to circle the wagons and get people all on the same page versus in other areas was it completely intuitive? And what lessons would you share with others who might be considering going on a similar path in their own organizations?
So I think one of the lessons is around sort of strategic alignment and support from the top. We had support from the top for a world-class impact management framework from the shareholder, from the board, from Exco. So we had quite a lot of, I guess, space to operate. And we were devising this at the same time as the new strategy. So there was a lot of input during and engagement during the design and build of the process. I mean, suffice to say, a scoring system that has a higher and a lower end. I mean, obviously, no one wants to find that their investments are going to be at the lower end. That was a hard discussion for us. I think it would be a hard discussion for everybody. So, anything where you're saying that a certain country is going to score more or less than another country, people will have different views about that. But what Paddy described was the sort of academic, or the links into the sort of academic development finance, the rigor behind this, the data, the analysis. So that's why we've tried to ground things. And I think the other thing is that it's taken we've been building it and engaging people throughout the process. So we soft launched it last year. We took it through our investment process, sort of first of all at the back of the investment papers before we sort of migrated it to the front, just to ensure that we had familiarized the organization with what it does and what it doesn't do. We've had a lot of discussions with our external IC members, and the score is very prominent in the investment papers, as is the dashboard. And one thing we didn't want to do, a little bit to the question Kathy asked, was we didn't want to make this an automatic, it's a 6, you go ahead. We want to still to interrogate, why are we doing the investment? What are the risks to impact? What is the depth of impact? So there are things not in the score that we didn't want to lose.
If I could just react to that, such great points, and something you said earlier really resonates, which is I remember in other organizations that have developed an impact rating, And then you bring the impact rating to the team at the top, and it's, from 1 to 10. And all of a sudden the low scored ones are the low impact ones. Well, the reaction we get is they're all high impact. Don't you dare bring us a score that shows us that some of our transactions are low impact. But it sounds like what you're doing is using this as a way to reflect that no one transaction will score high on all dimensions simultaneously, and that each transaction will have different strengths, and that you're constructing a portfolio which collectively achieves a number of goals simultaneously by including transactions, each of which bring unique strengths. Have I understood that correctly?
Well, so this is a topic we also discussed much, and because each score is added, something that is in the Venn diagram of the middle, so an investment that is inclusive and productive and sustainable will score higher than one that is just, as it were, reaching, has a great depth of income to low income people. So and that is why but we did feel it was fair that an investment that hits all three objectives should score higher than one that just hits one, if you sort of mean. But if it just hits one, to Hilcher's point, and has high contribution, that may be an excellent reason to do it. And that is part of the sort of, I guess, hopefully the maturity of an organization, and the fact it's a portfolio tool that allows us to do that.
So if I can just restate that, because I think it's addressing a bunch of the questions that I see in the Q&A. And you said this when you were starting to answer my question a few minutes ago. This is only one piece of your analysis, right? So this is the impact score, but then you have a contribution analysis, a thesis analysis, and it sounds like a risk analysis that are not represented mathematically here, but that you are also integrating. Is that correct?
That is correct. We considered integrating a risk score, a risk adjustment. We talked to others who've done that. And we felt, well, that at this point in time, we didn't have a methodology for assessing risk. Well, that's one point. But secondly, that we might end up, I guess, correcting everything back to a norm. So a high impact, high risk might get, as it were, a 5, and a low impact, low risk might get a 5. So you're not distinguishing that. So we didn't really want to include risk here. We feel that, I think, ex post will capture that. So if you don't achieve your impact ex post, it will come out in that wash.
Got it. Can I ask one more question? Is that
Kathy, I'm going to actually suggest maybe I turn to some of these audience, if you're okay with that. There's so many good questions. This has been, and I think Kathy and Mike, you've done a great job of drawing on some of them, but I want to be sure we get to some of the specifics here. And I will suggest that CDC Group may need to have open office hours around this system, because there's clearly a lot of interest in how to adapt this for other contexts and settings. But I think Kathy and Mike, through your questions, you've done a good job of helping tease out the very specific purpose of this scoring system, which is not, again, measurement per se, I think, as Patty put it, but rather, around principle 2, how at a portfolio level to compare CDC's evaluation of impact across investments. I'm going to start with a very specific question, slightly off topic, but I think just so important given the geopolitical situation. Greg Wilson asked in the chat, how in a crisis or recovery situation, for example, in the current very difficult situation in Ukraine, do you sort of prioritize impact when it comes to your impact scoring? So would your impact score consider, for example, would you to some extent override some of your elements to prioritize conflict prevention, for example?
The short answer to that is not in the impact score. So the impact score is built as a long-term patient, a huge amount of our investments, equity investments, it's built for that purpose. If I could take the example of our COVID response and where we sought to deploy capital, for example, through trade finance, trying to act counter-cyclically, reaching out to all of our investees to see if they needed working capital, our kind of equity investees to see if they needed working capital in that particular moment. We created a new technical assistance facility to help people think through their business needs, their kind of business response to COVID, and pivots that they might need to make. So, and in terms of our risk appetite, I mean, we have sort of high risk appetite as a DFI. So I think we would react to crises in certain different ways, but I mean, the impact score is built as a long-term vehicle.
Great. Okay, thank you. One from Carrie Ganella that I think you've touched on already, but how is it that you sort of circle back ex post after you've made an investment and go back to the impact score to check whether or not the results whether the process is actually working?
Hilche, let me pass that on to you.
Yeah, happy to take. So basically the way it works is that at the point of commitment, or actually already during our investment process, we calculate a score based on the expected impact. So we call that the ex ante score. And then we recalculate that score at regular intervals, which is for most of our portfolios every 2 years. So, and for some investments, it will remain the same. So if everything is delivered according to what we expected, you wouldn't see a change, but you can imagine, for instance, if an investment becomes 2x qualified, the score will go up. Or if we invest in a fund and we ex ante, we don't yet know exactly which geographies the fund will be investing in, it ends up investing in more developed countries than the country mix we expected, the score will go down ex post. So you see the score will vary. We can see it a bit like a valuation going up and down. So that will also happen with the impact score over time. We will continue doing that, and then up to the point of exit, at which point we recalculate the score, and then obviously the investment will be removed from our portfolio. So that is the intention of the ex post process.
Great. And although you've clearly designed this tailored to CDC's, own strategic objectives, I wonder if you can answer a couple of questions that have come in around how do you kind of use impact standards, or to what extent are sort of market industry standards used to kind of review the impact scores? For example, do you integrate impact classes from IMP in any way, or other frameworks like that into the scoring system itself?
Shall I try to go with that as well? So we used like a number of existing standards out there. So we mentioned the SDGs, which are linked to the productive needs. We mentioned the joint MDB methodology for climate finance, the 2X challenge framework that we use for gender finance, and all of those have been really, really helpful for us. So we could take existing standards and integrate it. There were a few elements where no standards existed yet. So for instance, the Black ownership and leadership for our Africa portfolio, which we have built our own framework for now. And I think the other element, and that's maybe a bit of a call for action for the audience as well, like where we see there is no existing standard necessarily, but we see, as we spoken to lots of other investors, others are thinking about this, for instance, the proxies for reach to low income. So rather than having to run a survey every time, we might be able to rely on certain proxies. So in the case of food and agriculture investments, like the size of farmland, or if we do a telecom investment, like the amount of spent on mobile internet per month, for instance, these could be used, and it could really simplify the process for us of scoring. So I think, yeah, so we've used certain standards that are out there, but we also recognize that there is room for us to, as an industry, to move forward and develop standards in other areas.
Great. Thank you, Hilcha. Just related to that last point, I think there's some appetite in the chat to hear just a little bit more detail about how you go about evaluating the gender and diversity qualification under inclusivity. One specific question is there a difference between ownership versus representation in senior management and the weights that you
Hilcha, can you take
factor?
this one? Or would you like me to?
So I think I suggest we share the link of the 2X challenge, which I think is very powerful. And I think there are many people in the audience who have adopted that already. For diversity, this is still something that we've only developed very recently. I think I'm looking at Liz as well in terms of, we are definitely planning to share that with the wider industry at some point as well. We've just started rolling it out for our 2022 strategy. It functions quite similar to the 2X framework, and it sets percentage thresholds for ownership and for leadership specifically, whereas the 2X challenge also looks at workforce and customers for gender. So to give you an indication, but I will post the 2X challenge link in the chat.
I mean, just one thing on the what we call the BOLD initiative, because that is one that is sort of BII specific. So when we looked at our portfolio, looking back, we thought that the number of investments that were backing Black owners or leaders was not as high as we would expect in our portfolio. And we felt, as an investor in Africa and an investor trying to attract more kind of capital to remain and stay in Africa, this was something that we wanted to prioritize over this strategy period. So that's why it really focuses on Black ownership and leadership, rather than, as Hilcha was saying, the sort of consumers or suppliers, which is integral to the 2X challenge.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to, for a few minutes, hand it back to Kathy and Mike to continue with some of their questions, and then I may have time for a couple more audience questions and comments before we conclude. So Kathy, maybe first you and then over to Mike.
Yeah, I was just reading through the questions, and again, I'm trying to kind of collect them into one. I just wanted to say how it's so great to see the specific questions that people are asking. We've already covered risk and contribution, but there's questions in there about additionality. There's questions in there about your how much metrics. I mean, there's a vocabulary that we all share now for this, which I'm just blown away by seeing this conversation. So kudos to all of us on that. The question I wanted to ask is a little bit more about if people are trying to do this themselves. Can you talk a little bit about the process, how long this took, who was involved, any advice you have for people who are trying to do their own scoring systems that they might not realize?
So it's taken 2 years to compile it. I guess we went live sort of, I would say, even though we soft tested or kind of shadow tested for 3 or 4 months, most of the people we talked to who did this sort of suggested doing it for longer. So we'll see how that works out. But we had quite a big team working on it. So the development impact team linked with the strategy team. As I mentioned, we were working on the sort of strategy in parallel. And there was a bottom-up business planning. So each of our investment business leads, so for example, infrastructure and climate, was also thinking of their 5-year strategy. So there were, in a good way, a lot of moving parts. I guess sort of 18 months ago, it did mean it sort of all, the sort of boiling up sort of moment was quite sort of, I guess, quite a big set of questions for the organization about sort of prioritization and all of these kind of things. In terms of the design choices, I mean, I said when I said at the beginning, we set some sort of parameters or some criteria about what it could do and not do. And we kept taking this back to our executive committee, back through the organization to test that we were sort of, I guess, creating it correctly in terms of what it can do and what it can't do in the organization. And that was it was just quite an open conversation, I think. So I would recommend that, certainly. And I'd recommend keeping it quite linked to the business development or kind of your investment horizons. And it helped us think through the dual mandate. So our kind of objective now is to maximize development impact subject to meeting financial return hurdles. So I think it's helped us sort of crystallize big questions for development finance institutions. Also, I've seen in the chat some loads of questions that we debated ourselves. So the one about is an impact investment that hits a kind of a 2, the same as one that is a kind of a 4. And maybe I'll hand back to Paddy to sort of talk about that, because it's a really spot on question. I mean, essentially, we do want the sort of peaks, the 4s in there. So, you know, but how do you design a system that both recognizes that something that hits all 3 objectives is better, and that, I mean, some of these are kind of mathematical questions which don't have any answers to. So I would recommend that. I mean, we are again lucky as a DFI that we have a development impact team that is associated with each of the investment teams that works embedded. So in terms of some of the questions around kind of data or how long does it take, we are already embedded in the cycle. We have tried to leverage what we do already. We have built in a bias to knowing more about impact rather than less. So in the system, some of those default scores, basically, if you don't know, your score is likely to be lower than if you do know. So there are some like, I guess, you know, leanings to knowing more about your impact that are built into the actual like bones of the score. Paddy, what else would you add to what we've learned and what you'd recommend for others?
Well, consult early, consult often, and keep at it. I mean, and I don't know what else to add on this sort of our 3 2s the same as a 6 point, because we have ended up with a system in which a 6 in one dimension is going to be regarded by the organization as equivalent to a 2 in each. That's exactly where the score gets us to. And I'm just going to almost, I'm afraid, repeat what I say, is that we had to test it, we had to look at it, we had to keep thinking, does this seem sensible and right and proportionate, and get to the place where we felt the answer was yes. I mean, I said that there wasn't much science to it. I imagine if I had a lot of money and time and economists, I might try and be able to find some ways of putting a bit more kind of foundation behind these comparative judgments. But it does feel to me that would be a very ambitious project that wouldn't necessarily, you know, there's not necessarily a obviously superior method out there for us to abuse, I don't think.
Maybe I will add, if I may add one thing on the 222-114 question. So besides the score, like we also have targets for climate finance, for instance, and for our gender finance. So you would expect we need to have a certain amount of, in sustainable, for instance, scoring at least a 3 and qualify as climate finance, because otherwise we don't hit our climate finance target. So I just wanted to add that as well, that the impact score is not our only impact target that we use at the portfolio level.
I do just want to point out that I know the CDC group was motivated to have this webinar and to put their resources out to the market because they see the effort that they went to put this together as somewhat of a public benefit and a public good. So the CDC scoring framework really is meant, I think, not only for the institution's own benefit, but for the benefit of the industry to adapt and use for its own purposes, lest folks get discouraged by the fact it took 2 years and so many different stakeholders. I want to at least make that point, that the whole point of this webinar, and I think CDC's time in in putting this out to market is hopefully to cut down some of the time and pain it took to arrive at this. Mike, I'd like to know if you have a kind of final point that you'd like to add or comment at this point in the conversation.
Oh, thank you, Christina. I mean, I was just reflecting on what Jill just said about there being certain areas where no standards or guidance exist. And I actually would point at this as being one of those areas, the measurement and aggregation and management of impact at the portfolio level. And so I empathize with CDC Group and having to come up with something new because there were no, I should say, few examples to follow. And I hope that it will get a lot of traction, that it will have a lot of eyes, and that over time, more organizations will follow suit and either, borrow respectfully pieces of what CDC did or even develop their own approaches so that best practices can begin to coalesce and it'll be easier for those who follow in the future.
Great. I think it'll be impossible to get to all of the detailed questions that are coming in. I do want to echo Kathy's remark that it's just really quite breathtaking to see how sophisticated this discussion is, and really how significant the growth in the discipline of impact management and measurement has been over the last several years, as echoed in this conversation. I'd like to turn it over to Liz to maybe make a couple of just closing remarks before we formally wrap up, and maybe to share with participants what more they can expect from CDC in terms of putting out some of the resources that they've created to the market. The slides, for example, being one.
Yeah, so thank you very much. And I'd like to thank Mike and Kathy as well, because their insights and, sort of understanding of this also gives me a lot of confidence, because it does feel still quite a nascent field, but I can see from the questions coming in that it is developing with the right kind of input and resources extremely sort of fast. I mean, why are we sharing this? We're sharing this because we do hope that it does sort of help others when they're making their, or kind of coming up with their impact management systems. Please do feel free to borrow as much as you like if it is aligned to your investing business. We back tested it on 400 of our investments, so we know it sort of suits us. So that's one thing. The other thing is we do have a lot of materials sort of available. I mean, I think our ESG toolkit for fund managers is one of our kind of world-class sets of sort of resources for the field. We have not shared as much on the, as it were, the impact management side maybe to date, and that is a real priority for the next few years, well, weeks, months, and years. So from the framework to our work, which we've done on for example, on contribution or additionality, this kind of impact scoring, and all of the underlying kind of theories of change. And I mean, they are also all publicly available. So that's the sort of real kind of robust background. So that's all I really have to add at this stage. So thank you, Christina.
Fabulous. Well, with that, I'm going to thank our panel, particularly the CDC Group, but also Kathy Clark and Mike McCrellis for not just participating in this panel, but for all the important work they're doing to continue to build the field and the discipline of impact investing and impact management. It's a privilege to work with all of you, and look forward to having another webinar in a year's time to share lessons learned from your first year of implementing the system, Liz and team. Thanks again, and thanks to all our participants.